The doors of the audition hall opened, and a girl named Lily Carter felt her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room could hear it. She was 18 years old, wearing a plain gray dress and a pair of old black shoes her grandmother had bought her 2 years ago. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from fear. This was the moment she had been waiting for since she was 6 years old, sitting on a wooden stool in the back room of a small laundromat, pretending the folding table was a piano. 3 judges sat behind a long table at the front of the hall. Their faces showed no excitement, no curiosity, nothing at all. They had already seen 40 students that morning, and they looked tired. The man in the middle, an older gentleman named Edward Whitfield, glanced at his papers and then at Lily without much interest. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice flat and businesslike, "your file says you have no formal training, no certificates, no recommendation letters from any school." "That is correct, sir," Lily answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Edward exchanged a quick glance with the woman beside him, a sharp-eyed judge named Claire Bennett. There was no need for words between them. Their expression said everything. This audition would be short. "Then let us not waste time," Edward said. "Play something basic. A simple scale will do, perhaps a short etude, nothing complicated." The words landed on Lily like a slap, though she knew he meant nothing cruel by them. He simply expected nothing from her. He had already decided, before she had even touched the keys, that she did not belong in this room. Lily walked to the piano at the center of the stage. It was a beautiful instrument, polished and gleaming under the stage lights, nothing like the old upright piano at home, with its 3 broken keys and its slightly out-of-tune middle octave. She sat down, placed her fingers gently on the keys, and closed her eyes for 1 second. In that single second, she remembered everything. She remembered her grandmother, Margaret Carter, working long hours at the laundromat just to keep food on the table after Lily's parents passed away in a car accident when she was only 7 years old. She remembered the nights she practiced alone after closing time, when the smell of detergent filled the air and the hum of the washing machines became her only audience. She remembered crying the day she found out the school music program had been canceled because there was no money left for instruments. She remembered deciding, right there in that empty hallway, that no one and nothing would ever stop her from playing. She opened her eyes and began. At first, her fingers moved slowly, almost shyly, playing a few notes that could have belonged to any simple piece a beginner might choose. The judges barely looked up. Claire Bennett tapped her pen against the table, already preparing to write a polite rejection. Then everything changed. The simple melody twisted into something deeper, something wild and alive. Lily's hands began to move faster, her fingers dancing across the keys with a kind of hunger that seemed impossible for someone with no formal training. The notes climbed higher and higher, then crashed down into powerful chords that shook the air of the hall. She wove together pieces of classical music she had taught herself from old library books, fragments of jazz she had learned from cracked recordings on an ancient radio, and an original melody she had written herself during countless lonely nights, a melody that told the story of a girl who refused to give up. Edward Whitfield slowly set down his pen. His eyes widened. Claire Bennett stopped tapping completely, her mouth slightly open. The third judge, a quiet man named Henry Crawford, leaned forward in his chair, completely forgetting the papers in front of him. The music filled every corner of the room. It was not perfect in the way a textbook would describe perfection, but it was honest, raw, and full of feeling in a way none of the judges had heard all day. Lily's whole body moved with the music now, her shoulders rising and falling, her head tilting as if she were having a conversation with the piano itself. She was no longer thinking about the judges, or the audition, or the fear that had gripped her only minutes before. She was simply playing, the way she had always played, with everything she had inside her. The final section of the piece built into a storm of sound, her fingers racing across the keys faster than seemed humanly possible, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music slowed. The notes became soft and tender, almost like a whisper, before fading into silence with one final, gentle chord. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. The silence stretched on, heavy and complete, the kind of silence that comes after something truly remarkable. Lily sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the keys, suddenly aware again of where she was. Her heart was racing. Had she made a mistake? Had she done something wrong? The silence felt endless. Then Edward Whitfield slowly stood up from his chair. His eyes were wet with tears he did not bother to hide. Beside him, Claire Bennett was pressing a hand against her chest, and Henry Crawford was simply staring at the piano, shaking his head in disbelief. "Where," Edward finally said, his voice rough with emotion, "did you learn to play like that?" Lily looked down at her hands for a moment, before answering. "Nowhere," she said softly. "Everywhere. My grandmother's laundromat, library books, an old radio that barely worked, a piano with 3 broken keys that I fixed myself with tape and patience." She paused, allowing herself a small, nervous smile. "I just never stopped playing, even when there was no reason to believe anyone would ever hear me." Edward Whitfield walked around the long table, something the other judges had never seen him do in all his years of judging auditions. He stopped in front of Lily and extended his hand. "Miss Carter," he said, "in 20 years of sitting behind that table, I have never been so wrong about a student before they even sat down, and I have never been happier to admit it." Lily shook his hand, still hardly able to believe what was happening. Claire Bennett wiped her eyes and gave a small, warm laugh. "That was not basic at all," she said. "That was extraordinary." As Lily walked off the stage that day, her legs still trembling, her mind still spinning, she had no idea that her moment of triumph was only the beginning of a much harder journey. She had no idea that within days, a phone call would arrive that would test everything she had just won and force her to choose between the dream she had fought so hard for and the only family she had left in the world. The bus ride home felt different that day. The streets looked the same, the buildings looked the same, but Lily felt like an entirely new person was sitting in that seat by the window. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, the look on Edward Whitfield's face, the sound of her own music filling that grand hall. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that something good was finally happening in her life. When she walked through the door of the small apartment above the laundromat, she found her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her, untouched. Margaret Carter looked up, and Lily could see immediately that something was wrong. Her grandmother's face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she folded a piece of paper and slid it under a napkin, as if trying to hide it. "How did it go, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, forcing a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Lily wanted to tell her everything, the judges standing up, the tears in Edward Whitfield's eyes, the words extraordinary and remarkable that still echoed in her mind, but something about her grandmother's expression made the words catch in her throat. "It went well," Lily said carefully. "Grandma, what is that paper?" Margaret hesitated, then sighed and pulled the paper back out from under the napkin. It was a letter from the bank, the kind of letter that nobody ever wants to receive, filled with words like overdue and final notice and risk of closure. The laundromat, the only source of income the family had ever known, was in serious trouble. Margaret had been hiding the truth for months, working longer hours, skipping meals, telling Lily that everything was fine so that nothing would distract her from her music. Lily stared at the letter, her excitement from the audition slowly draining away, replaced by a cold, heavy fear. The scholarship she had just earned, if she truly had earned it, would change her life. But it would also mean leaving the laundromat, leaving her grandmother to face this crisis completely alone. And if the laundromat closed, there would be no home to return to at all. That night, Lily lay awake in her small bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling above her bed, listening to the distant hum of the washing machines downstairs that never seemed to stop running, even at this late hour. She thought about the music still ringing in her ears, the feeling of finally being seen after years of being invisible, and she thought about her grandmother, the woman who had given up everything to raise her, now facing the possibility of losing the only thing she had left. Somewhere deep inside, Lily knew that the real test of her courage was not the audition she had already finished. The real test was still ahead of her, and it was about to begin. 3 days after the audition, an envelope arrived at the laundromat with the conservatory's golden emblem printed in the corner. Lily's hands trembled as she opened it, and her grandmother stood beside her, drying her hands on her apron, both of them holding their breath. The letter confirmed everything. Lily had been accepted into the conservatory with a full scholarship, covering tuition, housing, and even a small allowance for books and supplies. It was more than Lily had ever dared to hope for. She read the letter twice, then a third time, as if the words might disappear if she looked away. But instead of joy, a strange heaviness settled over the small kitchen. Margaret read the letter over Lily's shoulder, and for a moment her tired eyes lit up with pride. Then her gaze drifted to the bank letter still sitting on the counter, and the light dimmed again. "This is wonderful news," Margaret said, though her voice wavered. "You earned this, Lily, every single bit of it." "I cannot leave you here alone with all of this," Lily said, gesturing toward the stack of unpaid bills. "Not now, not when everything is falling apart." Margaret reached out and took her granddaughter's hands firmly in her own. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "I did not raise you, and I did not work every single day of my life, just so you could throw away your future to take care of an old woman and a laundromat. Your parents would want this for you. I want this for you. This is not a discussion." Lily wanted to argue, but the determination in her grandmother's eyes silenced her. Still, that night, she made a quiet decision of her own. She would accept the scholarship, but she would also find a way to help. She began searching for part-time work near the conservatory, anything that could send a little extra money home each month, even if it meant less sleep and even less free time than a new student already had. 2 weeks later, Lily arrived at the conservatory with a single suitcase and her heart full of nervous excitement. The campus was unlike anything she had ever seen: tall stone buildings covered in ivy, wide hallways lined with portraits of famous musicians, and practice rooms filled with pianos far more beautiful than anything she had ever touched before. For a girl who grew up surrounded by the smell of detergent and the sound of spinning dryers, it felt like stepping into another world entirely. Her roommate, a cheerful girl named Olivia Hart, greeted her with an easy smile and an instant friendliness that put Lily slightly at ease. Olivia had grown up taking private lessons since she was 4 years old, and her family had paid for the best teachers money could buy. Yet there was no trace of arrogance in her, only genuine curiosity about the girl who had walked into an audition with no training and somehow earned a full scholarship. "Everyone is talking about you," Olivia said one evening, as they unpacked boxes in their small shared room. "They say Professor Whitfield actually stood up during your audition. He never does that. Not ever." Lily blushed and shrugged off the compliment, still not quite believing the story had spread so quickly. But not everyone at the conservatory greeted her with the same warmth as Olivia. There was a boy in her year named Daniel Ross, the son of a well-known concert pianist, who had been considered the top student in his class since the very first week of school. Daniel had spent his entire life preparing for moments like this, with private tutors, expensive instruments, and a level of confidence that came from never once doubting his place in the world of music. When word spread about Lily's audition, and the way she had supposedly moved the judges to tears, with no formal training at all, something in Daniel's expression hardened every time her name was mentioned. "It is a nice story," he said to a group of classmates one afternoon in the hallway, just loud enough for Lily to hear as she passed by. "A girl from a laundromat moves the judges to tears. Very inspiring. Let us see if she can actually keep up once real work begins." Lily kept walking, pretending she had not heard him, though the words stung more than she wanted to admit. She told herself that his opinion did not matter, that she had earned her place here, and that the only thing she needed to focus on was the music itself. Yet a small voice in the back of her mind began to whisper a question she had never truly considered before. What if her audition had simply been a lucky moment, a single burst of emotion that she would never be able to recreate under pressure? The first few weeks of classes tested that fear in every possible way. Lily quickly discovered that raw talent alone was not enough. Her classmates could read complex sheet music at a glance, a skill she had never properly learned, since she had taught herself mostly by ear, listening to recordings over and over until she understood how the pieces fit together. In her first formal lesson, her teacher, a stern but fair instructor named Professor Gerald Whitmore, asked her to sight read a piece she had never seen before, and Lily struggled through it painfully, her fingers hesitating over notes that her classmates would have played without thinking twice. "You have remarkable instincts, Miss Carter," Professor Whitmore said afterward, not unkindly, but honestly. "But instinct alone will only carry you so far in this place. You will need discipline, structure, and a tremendous amount of work to catch up to where you need to be." Lily nodded, swallowing the lump forming in her throat. She had expected the work to be hard. She had not expected to feel so behind, so out of place, surrounded by students who had been preparing for this moment since they were old enough to walk. Determined not to fail, Lily threw herself into a routine that left little room for anything else. She woke before sunrise each morning to practice sight reading before her classes began. She spent her lunch breaks in empty practice rooms instead of the dining hall, working through scales and exercises she had never formally learned. On weekends, while many of her classmates relaxed or visited their families, Lily took a part-time job at a small cafe near the campus, washing dishes and serving coffee for a few hours each shift, carefully saving every coin she could to send back home to her grandmother. The exhaustion began to wear on her. Dark circles formed under her eyes, and there were days she barely had the energy to lift her arms during practice. Olivia noticed the toll it was taking and often urged her to slow down, to rest, to take care of herself the way she took care of her music. But Lily could not stop. Every time she thought about quitting, even for a single afternoon, she thought about her grandmother working alone in the laundromat and the bank letter still sitting on the kitchen counter back home. One evening, after a particularly difficult lesson where she had stumbled through an entire piece, Lily sat alone in a practice room long after the other students had gone to dinner. She rested her forehead against the cool wood of the piano, fighting back tears of frustration. The door creaked open, and she quickly wiped her eyes, expecting to see a janitor or another student. Instead, it was Professor Whitmore, holding 2 cups of tea. He set 1 cup down beside her without a word and sat down on a nearby chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Do you know why I agreed to teach you, Miss Carter?" he finally asked. Lily shook her head, too tired to guess. "Because in that audition, I heard something I rarely hear from students who have studied music their entire lives," he said. "I heard truth. Most of my students play notes correctly. You play feelings correctly. That is far rarer and far more difficult to teach." He paused, taking a slow sip of his tea. "But truth alone is not enough on a concert stage. You need the skill to support it, or that truth will get buried under mistakes. That is what we are building here. Not erasing what makes you special, but giving it the strength to survive under pressure." His words settled over Lily like a warm blanket on a cold night. For the first time since arriving at the conservatory, she felt that perhaps she was not simply a charity case, a lucky accident who had stumbled into a place she did not belong. Perhaps she truly was meant to be there, struggles and all. As the weeks passed, slowly and painfully, Lily began to improve. Her sight reading grew sharper. Her technical skills, while still rougher than her classmates, started to catch up piece by piece. She began to find moments during practice where the discipline and the raw emotion finally worked together instead of fighting against each other, and in those moments, something truly beautiful began to emerge. Then, one afternoon, a notice appeared on the main bulletin board outside the concert hall, drawing a crowd of excited students. The conservatory's annual winter showcase was approaching, a prestigious event where selected students performed in front of judges, alumni, and important figures from the music industry. For many students, it was the single most important performance of their entire year, a chance to be noticed by scouts, scholarship donors, and even professional orchestras. Only a handful of first-year students would be chosen to perform. Lily stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding as she scanned the list of names that Professor Whitmore had submitted for consideration. Near the bottom, almost too small to notice at first glance, she saw her own name. Daniel Ross stood nearby, staring at the same list with narrowed eyes, his jaw tight with visible irritation. He had expected to be the top name on that list, the obvious star performer chosen without question. Instead, his name appeared alongside Lily's, two first-year students given the rare honor of performing before the entire conservatory community. As Lily turned away from the bulletin board, still trying to process the news, she caught Daniel's eye for just a moment. There was no warmth in his expression, no congratulations, only a cold, calculating look that sent an unexpected chill down her spine. She told herself she was imagining things, that competition simply brought out tension in everyone, and that surely there was nothing more to it than that. She had no way of knowing, walking back to her dormitory that evening with the excitement of the showcase buzzing in her chest, that Daniel Ross had already begun quietly planning how to make sure that her moment on that stage would never go as smoothly as she hoped. The weeks leading up to the winter showcase passed in a blur of practice rooms, late nights, and the constant hum of nervous anticipation that seemed to fill every hallway of the conservatory. Lily had chosen to perform an original piece, one she had quietly composed in the early hours of the morning, inspired by the sound of washing machines spinning, the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, and the long road that had brought her from a laundromat to this enormous stage. Professor Whitmore had helped her refine it, tightening the structure without stripping away the raw emotion that made it special, and by the final week, Lily felt, for the first time, truly ready. Daniel Ross, meanwhile, had chosen to perform a technically demanding classical piece, one that few students his age would even attempt, designed to showcase his flawless precision and years of expensive training. He practiced for hours each day in the largest rehearsal hall, often leaving the door open so that other students would walk past and hear exactly how perfect his playing had become. Yet despite the impressive sound, something about his demeanor had grown increasingly tense as the showcase drew closer. He had overheard whispers among the staff, comments about how surprisingly strong Lily's new composition was, how Professor Whitmore had called it one of the most promising pieces written by a first-year student in many years. Each whispered compliment felt like a personal insult to a young man who had spent his entire life being told he was the best. 2 nights before the showcase, Lily stayed late in her assigned practice room, running through her piece one final time before the dress rehearsal scheduled for the following morning. The hallway lights had already dimmed for the evening, and most students had returned to their dormitories. She placed her sheet music on the stand, a carefully handwritten copy she had spent weeks perfecting, and stepped out briefly to refill her water bottle from the hallway fountain. When she returned only a few minutes later, something felt wrong. Her sheet music, the only complete copy of her original composition, was missing from the stand. Lily's heart dropped into her stomach. She searched frantically around the piano, beneath the bench, inside her bag, but there was no trace of it anywhere. Panic rose in her chest as she realized what this meant. Without that sheet music, recreating certain complex sections of the piece from memory under the pressure of a dress rehearsal the very next morning would be nearly impossible. She rushed to find Professor Whitmore, who was still in his office grading papers. When she explained what had happened, his expression grew serious, though he tried to remain calm for her sake. "Do you remember the piece well enough to rewrite it tonight?" he asked. "Most of it," Lily said, her voice trembling. "But there are sections, especially near the ending, that I changed so many times. I am not certain I remember the final version perfectly." Professor Whitmore nodded slowly. "Then we have a long night ahead of us. Sit down and let us begin reconstructing it together, note by note." For the next several hours, long after midnight, Lily sat at the piano in Professor Whitmore's private studio, playing fragments of melody over and over, while he carefully wrote down each note on fresh manuscript paper. It was exhausting, frustrating work, filled with moments where Lily's memory faltered, and she had to play the same passage repeatedly until the correct version finally surfaced. By the time they finished, the sky outside the window had already begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and Lily had perhaps 2 hours left before the dress rehearsal would begin. She splashed cold water on her face in the dormitory bathroom, her eyes heavy and burning with exhaustion, and made her way to the rehearsal hall on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The other selected students were already warming up, their fingers moving smoothly and confidently across their keys, while Lily felt as though she were walking through thick fog. During the dress rehearsal, her exhaustion showed. Her fingers fumbled over a passage she normally played without effort, and she had to stop and restart an entire section, something she had never done before in front of her classmates. From across the room, she noticed Daniel watching her with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between satisfaction and something almost like guilt, though it vanished so quickly she could not be certain she had seen it at all. Later that day, exhausted and discouraged, Lily sat alone in the dormitory common room, staring blankly at the rewritten sheet music spread across the table in front of her. Olivia found her there and immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened to you?" Olivia asked, sitting down beside her. "You look like you have not slept in days." Lily explained everything: the missing sheet music, the long night spent rewriting it from memory, the disastrous rehearsal that morning. Olivia's expression darkened as she listened. "Sheet music does not simply disappear, Lily," she said carefully. "Practice rooms lock automatically after a certain hour. Who else has access to that hallway after hours?" The question hung in the air between them, and Lily felt a cold realization settle over her. She thought of Daniel's strange expression during the rehearsal, the tension that had grown between them since the names had been posted on the bulletin board. But she had no proof, nothing concrete enough to accuse anyone, and the showcase was now only a single day away. Pointing fingers without evidence would only create more problems, and right now, every ounce of her remaining energy needed to go towards saving her performance. That evening, instead of resting as Professor Whitmore had strongly advised, Lily made a decision. She would not simply rely on the rushed, rewritten version of her piece. Instead, she would return to the original feeling that had inspired the music in the first place, the same feeling that had carried her through her very first audition months earlier. She closed her eyes, sat at the piano in an empty practice room, and instead of forcing herself to remember exact notes from the night before, she allowed herself to simply feel the music again, the way she always had, before formal training had ever entered her life. Slowly, painfully, pieces began clicking back into place, not perfectly, but honestly. She practiced until well past midnight again, despite her body's protests, determined to walk onto that stage with something true, even if it was not flawless. The morning of the winter showcase arrived with a strange, electric energy throughout the entire conservatory. Families and important guests began arriving early, filling the grand concert hall with quiet, excited conversation. Backstage, students paced nervously, adjusting their clothing, running through final mental checklists, while teachers moved between rooms offering last-minute encouragement. Lily stood near a small mirror backstage, smoothing down the simple blue dress Olivia had insisted on lending her for the occasion. Her hands felt cold despite the warmth of the room, and the rewritten, slightly crumpled sheet music sat on a nearby table, a visible reminder of everything that had gone wrong in the past 2 days. She picked it up, studying the notes one final time, when Professor Whitmore approached, his expression calm and steady, in a way that immediately settled some of her nerves. "You do not need that anymore," he said gently, nodding toward the sheet music in her hands. "What if I forget something during the performance?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You will not forget the truth of why you wrote it," Professor Whitmore said. "The notes are simply the vehicle. The truth is what carried you into that audition months ago, and it is what will carry you onto this stage today. Trust it." Before Lily could respond, the stage manager appeared, informing the students that the showcase was about to begin. The first few performers took their turns on stage, each one impressive in their own way, their families beaming with pride from the audience. Daniel Ross performed shortly before Lily, his technically demanding piece executed with breathtaking precision, every note crisp and controlled, earning enthusiastic applause from the audience, and a satisfied, almost smug expression as he walked off stage. Then it was Lily's turn. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked toward the piano positioned at the center of the enormous stage, the bright lights making it nearly impossible to see the hundreds of faces watching her from the darkened audience. She sat down, placed her trembling fingers on the keys, and for one terrifying moment, her mind went completely blank. In the silence before she began, she thought of her grandmother, standing alone in the laundromat thousands of miles away, working tirelessly to give her this chance. She thought of the bank letter still sitting somewhere on that kitchen counter. She thought of the missing sheet music, the exhausting nights, the doubt that had crept into her mind more than once over the past 2 days, whispering that perhaps she truly did not belong in a place like this. And then she simply began to play. The first notes were soft, almost fragile, drifting out into the silent hall like a whisper carried on a quiet breeze. Slowly, the melody began to grow, gaining confidence with each measure, and Lily felt something shift inside her chest. The exhaustion, the fear, the doubt that had haunted her for the past 2 days began to dissolve, replaced by the same overwhelming honesty that had carried her through her very first audition. She played of the laundromat, the steady rhythm of spinning washing machines becoming a quiet, pulsing undertone beneath the melody. She played of her grandmother's hands, worn from years of work, folding endless piles of laundry while humming old songs under her breath. She played of empty hallways and library books and a radio that crackled with static, and of every single night she had refused to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier. The audience, which had been polite and attentive throughout the evening, grew unusually still. Parents who had been quietly checking their watches during earlier performances now sat perfectly upright, fully absorbed in the unfolding music. Even backstage, students who had already finished their own performances gathered near the curtains to listen, drawn by something undeniable in the sound filling the hall. Daniel Ross stood among them, arms crossed, his earlier satisfaction slowly fading into something far more complicated. He had expected, perhaps even hoped, that the missing sheet music would cause Lily's performance to collapse entirely. Instead, what he heard now was something his own flawless technical performance had never quite achieved, a sound that reached past simple admiration and touched something deeper in every single listener. As the piece built toward its climax, Lily's hands moved with a kind of fearless energy, the same energy that had once moved 3 exhausted judges to stand from their chairs in astonishment. The melody crested into a powerful, triumphant section, full notes ringing out and filling every corner of the enormous hall, before gradually softening into a tender, peaceful conclusion, much like a long, difficult journey finally reaching a place of rest. When the final note faded into silence, the hall remained quiet for a long moment, just as it had during her very first audition. Then, the silence broke into thunderous applause, growing louder and louder, until people throughout the audience rose to their feet. Lily sat at the piano, breathing heavily, tears blurring her vision as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything she had overcome in the past 2 days. Backstage, Professor Whitmore stood near the curtain, his arms folded, a quiet, proud smile spreading across his face. Olivia rushed forward the moment Lily stepped off stage, wrapping her in a tight hug, both of them laughing through happy tears. "You did it," Olivia said. "Despite everything, you actually did it." But not everyone backstage shared in the celebration. Daniel remained apart from the group, his expression unreadable, watching the scene with a strange tightness in his jaw. Later that evening, after the showcase had ended and most students had gathered in the dining hall for a small celebration, Olivia pulled Lily aside with an urgent expression on her face. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "I overheard Daniel talking to one of his friends near the practice rooms this afternoon. He mentioned something about the missing sheet music. I think he knows more about what happened than anyone realized." Lily felt her stomach tighten. Part of her wanted to march directly to Daniel and demand an explanation, but a larger part of her hesitated, unsure of what good an accusation would truly accomplish, especially without solid proof. That night, she decided to confront him directly, calmly, rather than involving the school administration immediately. She found Daniel alone in one of the smaller practice rooms late that evening, quietly running through scales, his earlier confidence noticeably subdued. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief moment, something close to guilt flickered across his face before his usual guarded expression returned. "Congratulations on your performance," he said stiffly. "It was unexpectedly good." "Did you take my sheet music?" Lily asked directly, deciding there was no point in dancing around the question. Daniel's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring down at the keys in front of him. Then, finally, he sighed, the tension in his shoulders deflating slightly. "I did not steal it to hurt you exactly," he said quietly. "I told myself I only wanted to see what made everyone so impressed by your work, to understand what Professor Whitmore meant when he called it remarkable. I borrowed it from your stand, intending to return it before you noticed it was missing. But then I read through it, and—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "It was good, Lily. Genuinely good. Better than anything I have written in years of formal training. I panicked, and instead of returning it immediately, I hesitated, telling myself I would slip it back unnoticed later. By the time I tried, you had already discovered it missing, and I was too afraid of the consequences to admit what I had done." Lily stared at him, a complicated mixture of anger and disbelief swirling inside her. "Do you have any idea what that night cost me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I barely slept. I nearly fell apart during the dress rehearsal in front of everyone." "I know," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, genuine regret visible in his expression for the first time. "And I am sorry. I let my own insecurity get the better of me. I have spent my entire life being told I am the most talented student in every room I enter, and then you walked in with no formal training at all, and somehow created something more honest than anything I have managed to produce. It frightened me more than I expected, and I made a poor decision because of it." Lily studied him for a long moment, the anger inside her slowly settling into something closer to quiet understanding. She had spent months feeling like an outsider among students who had every advantage handed to them since birth. It had never occurred to her that someone like Daniel, seemingly so confident and secure, might carry his own private fears about being good enough. "I am not going to report this to the administration," she finally said, "but you need to understand that talent is not something to be afraid of in someone else. There is room for both of us to be good at this, Daniel. You do not need to tear someone else down to prove your own worth." Daniel nodded slowly, looking almost relieved by her decision. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I will not forget this." Word of their private conversation never spread beyond the two of them, and in the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted between them. Daniel remained reserved, but the open hostility disappeared, replaced eventually by a cautious, growing respect. He even began offering Lily quiet pointers on technical exercises she still struggled with, while she, in turn, encouraged him to experiment more freely with composition instead of relying solely on flawless execution of other composers' work. As winter turned into spring, Lily's reputation at the conservatory continued to grow. Professor Whitmore submitted her original composition, the same piece she had performed at the winter showcase, to a prestigious national competition for young musicians, one that awarded not only recognition, but also a significant scholarship fund that could be used however the winning student saw fit. For Lily, that detail meant everything. A win would not only validate her musical journey, but could also provide enough financial security to finally lift her grandmother's laundromat out of danger permanently. The news that her composition had been selected as a finalist arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, delivered through a simple email that Lily read 3 times before fully believing it was real. Only 12 young musicians from across the entire country had been chosen as finalists, each one required to perform live in front of a panel of internationally recognized judges in just 6 weeks' time. Lily immediately called the laundromat, and when her grandmother picked up the phone, her voice already weary from a long day of work. Lily could barely contain her excitement as she shared the news. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by the unmistakable sound of Margaret Carter crying tears of pure joy. "I always knew," Margaret said through her tears. "From the very first day you sat at that old broken piano, humming melodies before you could even read words properly, I always knew you carried something special inside you." But amid the excitement, a quiet worry began forming in the back of Lily's mind. The national competition would be held in a concert hall far larger and more prestigious than anything she had performed in before, broadcast to a wide audience and judged by some of the most respected names in classical music. The pressure would be unlike anything she had faced, even during her original audition or the recent showcase. And complicating matters further, Professor Whitmore informed her gently that the competition rules required all finalists to perform an entirely new piece, something composed specifically within the 6-week preparation window, rather than reusing any previously performed composition. 6 weeks to create something entirely new, polish it to perfection, and prepare to perform it flawlessly in front of the most important audience of her life. The clock had already begun ticking, and this time, there would be no missing sheet music to blame if things went wrong. This time, everything depended entirely on what Lily could create from nothing but her own determination, her own talent, and the quiet, unwavering belief of the people who had chosen to stand beside her. The 6 weeks leading up to the national competition unfolded like a race against time that never seemed to slow down. Lily spent every spare moment hunched over manuscript paper, scribbling melodies, crossing them out and starting again, searching for the right combination of notes that could capture everything she wanted to express. Composing on demand proved far more difficult than she had imagined. The piece she had performed at the winter showcase had grown naturally over months of quiet, private moments, while this new composition needed to emerge fully formed within a matter of weeks, under the weight of enormous expectation. Professor Whitmore remained patient throughout the process, offering guidance without ever forcing his own ideas onto her work. "This piece must be yours," he reminded her repeatedly. "Not a copy of what worked before. Something new, born from where you are right now, not where you used to be." Lily struggled with that idea more than she expected. The story of the laundromat, her grandmother, and her humble beginnings had already been told through her previous composition. She did not want to simply repeat the same narrative in a different arrangement. She needed to find something new to express, something that reflected the journey she had taken since arriving at the conservatory, the friendships she had built, the rivalries that had softened into unexpected respect, and the quiet confidence she had slowly developed in herself. Late one evening, while walking back from the practice rooms, exhausted and frustrated after another day of false starts, Lily passed by the conservatory's old chapel, a small building rarely used except for special ceremonies. Through the open door, she noticed Olivia sitting alone at an old pipe organ, quietly playing a gentle, wandering melody, completely unaware that anyone was listening. Lily stood in the doorway, captivated by the simple beauty of the unplanned moment. Something about the unstructured freedom of Olivia's playing, completely without pressure or expectation, sparked an idea that had been missing from Lily's own forced attempts at composition. She realized, suddenly, that her newest piece did not need to tell a single dramatic story like her first composition had. It could instead capture something quieter, more universal, the feeling of finding unexpected friendship and belonging in a place that had once felt completely foreign. That night, inspired by the memory of Olivia's gentle melody drifting through the empty chapel, Lily began composing again, this time with a lighter, more open approach. Over the following days, the new piece slowly took shape, weaving together themes of uncertainty, transforming into trust, of isolation, slowly dissolving into genuine connection. She titled it simply, Becoming, a reflection of everything she had grown into since that first frightened audition many months earlier. As the competition date drew closer, Lily faced an unexpected complication that threatened to derail everything she had worked toward. A phone call arrived late one night, just 10 days before the national finals, and Lily's heart sank the moment she saw her grandmother's number flashing on her phone screen at such a late hour. Margaret's voice on the other end sounded weak and strained. She explained, between pauses to catch her breath, that she had collapsed earlier that evening while working at the laundromat, and a kind neighbor had rushed her to the hospital. The doctors suspected severe exhaustion combined with high blood pressure that had gone unmanaged for far too long, the result of months spent working long hours without proper rest, all while quietly hiding her financial worries from her granddaughter. Lily's entire world seemed to tilt sideways. Within hours, she had arranged emergency leave from the conservatory and boarded a bus back home, her carefully composed piece and the looming national competition pushed entirely from her mind. The only thing that mattered now was reaching her grandmother's bedside as quickly as possible. She arrived at the small hospital exhausted and frightened, finding Margaret resting in a narrow bed, looking smaller and more fragile than Lily had ever seen her. Despite her weakened condition, Margaret's eyes brightened the moment she saw her granddaughter walk through the door. "You should not have come," Margaret said weakly, though the relief in her voice betrayed how grateful she truly was. "The competition is so close, you cannot afford to lose this time." "You are more important than any competition," Lily said firmly, taking her grandmother's frail hand in her own. "I am not leaving until I know you are going to be all right." Over the following days, Lily stayed close to the hospital, splitting her time between sitting beside her grandmother and quietly practicing on a small electric keyboard she borrowed from a sympathetic nurse who had once studied music herself. The keyboard's sound was thin and artificial compared to the rich tone of a real piano, but it allowed Lily to keep her fingers moving, even as worry over her grandmother's health consumed most of her thoughts. Margaret's condition slowly stabilized over the following days, though doctors strongly advised that she would need significant rest and a complete change in her daily routine moving forward, something that immediately raised the painful question of what would happen to the laundromat without her constant presence. Lily found herself torn between two competing fears, worried about her grandmother's health and equally anxious about how much practice time she had already lost with only days remaining before the national finals. It was Olivia who ultimately stepped in to help, contacting Professor Whitmore the moment she realized how dire the situation had become. Within a day, Professor Whitmore had arranged for a temporary part-time worker to assist at the laundromat through a small community fund the conservatory maintained for exactly these kinds of emergencies, a fund few students even knew existed. He also personally called Margaret, offering quiet reassurance and insisting that Lily's place in the competition would remain secure no matter when she returned, even if it meant arriving only a day or two before the actual performance. With her grandmother finally stable and reluctantly assured that proper help had been arranged, Lily boarded a bus back toward the conservatory just 4 days before the national finals, her nerves frayed and her preparation far from where she had hoped it would be. She arrived late at night, exhausted from travel and worry, only to find Professor Whitmore waiting for her outside the dormitory, a steaming cup of tea already prepared in his hands. "We have 4 days," he said simply. "It is not the 6 weeks we originally had, but it is enough time if we use every hour wisely and trust the work you have already done." For the next 3 days, Lily practiced with an intensity she had never experienced before, pushing through exhaustion, fear, and the lingering worry about her grandmother that never fully left her mind. Professor Whitmore worked alongside her late into each night, helping refine small details in her composition, while Olivia, and even Daniel, surprising everyone including himself, took turns bringing meals to the practice room so Lily would not have to interrupt her focus. On the morning of the competition, Lily traveled by train to the Grand Concert Hall in a major city, accompanied by Professor Whitmore, who had insisted on personally escorting her. The hall itself was breathtaking, far larger and more ornate than anything she had performed in before, with rows upon rows of seats stretching back into a darkness that seemed to swallow the edges of the enormous room. Backstage, Lily met the other 11 finalists for the first time, each one clearly talented, clearly accomplished, many of them already familiar faces from prestigious music programs across the country. A young man named Charles Whitfield, no relation to the judge from her original audition, greeted her warmly, mentioning that he had heard whispers about her unusual journey into the world of formal music education. A confident violinist named Grace Sutton offered encouraging words as well, and Lily found herself slowly relaxing in the company of musicians who seemed genuinely supportive rather than competitive in the way Daniel had once been. When her turn finally arrived, Lily walked toward the grand piano positioned at the center of the enormous stage, the brilliant lights above making the vast audience disappear into a wall of darkness beyond the stage's edge. She thought briefly of her grandmother, resting safely back home, of Professor Whitmore watching from somewhere in the wings, of Olivia, and even Daniel, who had texted her a simple message of encouragement just hours earlier. She thought of every late night, every moment of doubt, every obstacle that had tried to convince her she did not belong in a place like this. She sat down at the piano, took a slow, steadying breath, and began to play. The piece unfolded gently at first, soft, searching notes representing the uncertainty of arriving somewhere completely unfamiliar, much like she had felt walking into the conservatory for the very first time. Slowly, the melody grew warmer, introducing small, playful phrases that echoed the easy friendship she had found with Olivia, the quiet, hard-won respect that had grown between herself and Daniel, and the patient wisdom Professor Whitmore had offered throughout her entire journey. The music built gradually, layer upon layer, into something rich and full, before settling into a tender, hopeful conclusion that spoke not of struggle, but of belonging. When the final note faded into silence, the enormous hall remained still for several long seconds, just as it had during her very first audition, before erupting into overwhelming applause. Lily rose from the piano bench, her legs trembling, and bowed toward an audience she still could not fully see beyond the brilliant stage lights. The judges deliberated for nearly an hour after the final performer finished, an agonizing wait during which Lily sat backstage with the other finalists, nervous energy filling the cramped waiting room. Finally, an announcer's voice called all 12 finalists back onto the stage to await the results. When the head judge finally stepped forward to announce the winner, Lily's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the opening remarks about the exceptional quality of every single performance that evening. Then, the judge spoke her name, and for a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air without truly registering in her mind. She had won. The applause that followed felt distant and dreamlike as Lily stood frozen on stage, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion so powerful that tears immediately filled her eyes. Charles Whitfield, standing nearby, was among the first to congratulate her, genuine warmth in his applause, despite his own disappointment at not winning himself. Backstage, Professor Whitmore embraced her with the closest thing to fatherly pride she had ever witnessed from him, and her phone, when she finally checked it, was already filled with messages from Olivia and even Daniel, both expressing their excitement from back at the conservatory. That night, Lily called her grandmother immediately, barely able to contain her joy as she shared the news. Margaret's voice, though still weak from her recent illness, was filled with unmistakable pride and relief. "The scholarship fund," Lily explained through happy tears. "It is enough to fix everything, Grandma. The laundromat, the debts, all of it. You will never have to worry about losing it again." In the months that followed, Lily's life changed in ways she had never imagined possible during those long, lonely nights practicing on a broken piano above a laundromat full of spinning machines. The prize money allowed her grandmother to finally pay off the laundromat's debts completely, with enough remaining to hire permanent help, ensuring Margaret could finally rest after decades of tireless work. Lily's composition, Becoming, gained attention from music programs and orchestras around the country, eventually leading to an invitation to perform alongside a professional symphony, an opportunity that would have seemed impossible to even imagine just 1 year earlier. Olivia remained Lily's roommate and closest confidant throughout the remainder of their time at the conservatory, their friendship growing stronger through every challenge they faced together. Professor Whitmore continued mentoring Lily throughout her years at the conservatory, often reminding her, Whenever success threatened to make her forget where she had come from, of the simple truth he had recognized the very first moment he heard her play. Years later, when Lily Carter stood on stages far larger than that small audition hall where her journey had truly begun, she often thought back to the judge, who had once asked for something basic, never imagining the storm of music and emotion that single request would unleash. She thought of her grandmother, who had sacrificed everything without complaint. She thought of broken pianos and library books, and lonely nights filled with nothing but determination and a quiet, unwavering belief that somewhere, somehow, her music would eventually be heard. And every single time she sat down to play, whether in front of a small audience or a sold-out concert hall, she carried that same simple truth with her, the truth that had first moved 3 exhausted judges to rise from their chairs in astonishment. Music, played honestly, from the very depths of one's own heart, could never truly be called basic at all.